Navigating database security usually feels like, well, trying to read poorly translated stereo instructions from the 80s.
Oh, absolutely.
You're just staring at this massive wall of technical jargon, flipping software switches, and just hoping nothing catches on fire when you deploy it.
Right, which is honestly a terrifying way to operate because it relies on this purely mechanical, almost binary mindset.
Like just checking boxes on a list.
Exactly. You check a box on a compliance sheet, you edit a line in a config file, and you just assume your data is safe because, the manual said it would be.
Yeah.
But attackers aren't reading your compliance checklist. They're actively mapping out your architecture, looking for the underlying logical flaws in how you flip those switches.
And that asymmetric warfare is exactly what brings us to today's deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating source document that dropped in March of 2026 from SOCFortress.
Yeah, the MongoDB Secure Deployment and Hardening Guide.
That's the one. But our mission today for you, the listener, isn't to just read you some dry, bulleted checklist for MongoDB 6 and 7 on Linux.
Nobody wants to listen to that.
No, definitely not. Instead, we want to extract the underlying philosophy of digital defense from this document. We're going to talk about building an invisible, actively defended vault for your data, starting from the outside in. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. To set the stage, it's really crucial to understand the intended audience here. This guide is designed heavily for infrastructure and platform engineering teams.
Right.
It makes it very clear that a secure database isn't just a single magical product you install. It's a layered strategy.
Defense in depth.
Exactly. It has to be built around strict access control, the principle of least privilege, and central logging. You really have to treat the database as a living, breathing ecosystem, not just a static hard drive sitting in a server rack.
Okay, let's unpack this ecosystem, starting with the absolute foundation, which is the perimeter.
Yeah, the outermost wall.
Right, because before you even think about tweaking an internal database setting, the guide is adamant that MongoDB needs to be placed on a private network. Database ports must be completely hidden from the public internet.
I know that might sound like common sense, but the reality is that the internet is just full of automated botnets.
Oh yeah, constantly scanning.
Just 24/7. These scripts are sweeping the entire IPv4 address space looking for port 27017.
Which is MongoDB's default port.
Right, and they aren't necessarily targeting your company specifically. They're just turning every single doorknob they can find to see if one is unlocked.
So by hiding that port and putting the database on an isolated subnet, you basically remove yourself from the background radiation of internet threats.
That's a great way to put it. You take your house off the public street map.
And once it's off the map, the guide insists that any configuration changes, like, say, editing the mongo.conf file or tweaking Linux service overrides, they have to be tracked using configuration management tools.
Yes. No random manual edits.
Right, which eliminates what we call cowboy coding.
Oh, cowboy coding is the worst. Because if a senior engineer logs directly into a server to, manually change a security setting to troubleshoot something.
And then forgets to change it back.
Exactly. That server is now a unique, undocumented snowflake. Configuration management tools ensure that your security posture is reproducible, it's version controlled, and it's uniform across your entire fleet.
So we're establishing a baseline of absolute control here. But the source goes a step further into what almost feels like the psychology of security.
The separation of identities.
Yes. The guide insists on strictly separating application identities from human administrator identities, like treating a piece of software entirely differently than a human engineer logging in.
Well, because their behavioral patterns and their risk profiles are fundamentally different. I mean, an application needs to perform the exact same predictable queries millions of times a day.
Right.
But a human administrator needs to occasionally perform highly sensitive maintenance tasks. If you use the same identity for both and the application gets compromised, well,
the attacker inherits those human-level administrative powers.
Precisely. It's game over.
Okay, but I want to push back on this strictness for a second because we have to talk about the real world of enterprise IT.
Sure.
If we lock down administrator access so tightly, the guide mentions requiring dedicated jump hosts, complex multi-factor authentication, restricted privilege groups. What happens when the system crashes at 3 a.m.?
The dreaded 3 a.m. page.
Yeah. The cluster is down, the company's bleeding $1 million an hour, and an on-call engineer needs to get in immediately. Doesn't this level of security friction cause an operational disaster?
That is the classic tension between security and availability. But the guide specifically accounts for this nightmare scenario with what it calls break glass admin access.
Break glass, like physically breaking the glass on a fire alarm.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
You don't just leave a convenient back door unlocked for emergencies because attackers will find it. Instead, you build a heavily alarmed emergency door.
So you can do it, but everyone is going to know you did it.
Right. To use that break glass access, the engineer still has to authenticate through a secure jump host using MFA. But the key difference is the friction built into the process.
What kind of friction?
Well, it triggers immediate alerts to the security team. It often requires a secondary approval workflow. And most importantly, it initiates aggressive, unavoidable auditing of the entire event.
Wow.
Every single command that engineer types is recorded and scrutinized after the fact.
So the friction is actually the feature, not a bug.
Exactly. It forces the engineer to definitively state, yes, this is an actual emergency, and I accept full accountability for what I'm about to do.
That makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So we've established where this vault lives
Yeah.
and who is allowed near the building.
Right.
Now we have to interrogate how we actually verify the identities of those knocking on the front door. We're moving to the bouncers and the badges.
Authentication and authorization.
Yeah. The guide explicitly flags the failure to enable the security authorization setting as a critical vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely. If this isn't turned on, the bouncer at the door is effectively asleep.
Right. The database will just accept commands from literally anyone who knows where the server is.
Which defeats the entire purpose of the vault.
Exactly. And the guide gives us very specific tools to arm the bouncer. For standard password authentication, it heavily prefers a protocol called SCRAM HA256,
Yes, scram.
which, whenever I read these security docs, I see SCRAM mentioned. Mechanically, what is that actually doing differently than just sending a password?
Good question. So SCRAM stands for Salted Challenge Response Authentication Mechanism.
Okay.
Instead of your client sending the actual password across the network, where, it could potentially be intercepted by someone eavesdropping, the server sends a math puzzle to the client.
A puzzle, like a challenge.
Right, a challenge. The client uses the password to solve the math puzzle and sends only the answer back. Then the server verifies the answer.
So the password itself never actually travels over the wire.
Exactly. You prove you know the secret without ever revealing the secret.
That's brilliant. And for human administrators, the people wielding that highly privileged access we just talked about, the guide suggests abandoning passwords entirely.
Yeah, passwords for admins are a huge risk.
It recommends using 5.509 cryptographic certificates or integrating with central identity providers like LDAP or Kerberos.
Which is great because that ties database access directly to the company's central employee directory. If an employee is terminated, their database access just vanishes instantly.
No lingering accounts.
Exactly.
But there's a specific vulnerability called out here that I find absolutely fascinating. It's about ensuring MongoDB does not bypass authentication via the localhost exception.
Oh, the localhost exception. That is a classic developer convenience that routinely turns into a total security nightmare.
How so?
Well, by default, some database configs assume that if a connection is originating from the exact same machine where the database is running the local host, it must be legitimate.
Because the logic is that the admin is sitting right there at the physical keyboard.
Right, exactly.
It's basically the ultimate Trojan horse vulnerability.
It really is.
I mean, you spend millions of dollars building this massive perimeter, hiding the ports, demanding cryptographic certificates, and then you just give a free pass to anyone who's already inside the house.
Yeah. If an attacker exploits a completely unrelated vulnerability in, say, a web application running on that same server, they are now operating from the local host.
Wow. And if the database blindly trusts local host connections?
Then that basic web exploit just handed the attacker the keys to the entire database cluster. It completely invalidates your external perimeter.
Which perfectly sets up the guide's rules around the built-in root account. I was thinking of the root account like the master key to a skyscraper.
That's a great analogy.
You wouldn't hand the master key the entire building to the plumber who was just hired to fix a sink on the 4th floor.
No, you wouldn't. And that's the core tenet of the principle of least privilege.
Right.
Your custom web application does not need the ability to delete the entire database cluster or drop user accounts or modify security settings. It only needs permission to read and write data to its specific assigned collections.
Okay, so we have the best bouncers at the door. They're checking heavily encrypted math puzzles instead of passwords. They aren't falling for the Trojan horse localhost trick.
Right.
But even with all of that, the physical walls of the vault itself need to be bulletproof. So let's talk about structural integrity at the operating system layer, because this is where the guide gets brilliantly
Oh,
paranoid.
this is where a lot of deployment teams drop the ball. They secure the database software, but leave the underlying Linux operating system completely porous.
Yeah, the guide mandates that MongoDB must run under a dedicated, non-privileged OS user and group.
Right. It shouldn't just run wild as the system root user.
But it goes so much deeper than just user accounts.
Hmm.
The guide details specific system unit hardening settings, systemed being the service manager in Linux that starts and stops background programs. And the guide tells us to apply parameters like no deprivileges, protect system, and to restrict the capability bounding set.
Right.
I love this concept. It's like putting the database process inside a straitjacket before locking it in the vault.
The straitjacket is a highly accurate metaphor. Take protect system, for instance.
Okay, what does that do?
When you enable that in system, it essentially creates a mirage for the database process. It mounts critical Linux system directories as strictly read-only, solely for the database.
Oh, wow.
So even if an attacker finds a zero-day exploit in MongoDB and completely takes over the database process, they physically cannot overwrite system files to establish a persistent backdoor. The Linux kernel simply refuses the right action.
And no new privileges means exactly what it sounds like, right?
Exactly. Even if the compromised database process tries to execute another file on the server that has higher administrative rights, the straitjacket holds. The OS blocks the privilege escalation.
That is incredible.
They also restrict the raw read and write access to the actual data files, the config files, and the encryption keys strictly to that specific MongoDB service account.
So if an attacker breaches the server through another service, they can't just open the folder and copy your database files onto a thumb drive.
No, the file system permissions block them out completely.
What I found really clever in the source material is how this all ties into compliance.
Oh, the fixed stuff.
Yeah. When the guide talks about enabling FIX, the Federal Information Processing Standard for cryptography, the implementation method relies heavily on these exact operating system straitjackets.
Right. Good security hygiene essentially equals compliance.
FIPS compliance isn't just about plugging in a magic cryptography module. It's explicitly tied to running as a non-privileged user and locking down those file permissions.
It's a brilliant synergy. The foundation of any advanced cryptography is a secure operating environment. You can have the strongest encryption keys in the world, but if the OS allows anyone on the server to casually open the folder where those keys are stored,
Then the cryptography is entirely useless.
exactly, it's completely defeated.
Speaking of encryption, we have to talk about moving the gold between the vaults.
Data in transit.
Yes. The guide marks disabling legacy TLS protocols as a critical severity item. We're instructed to configure the server to strictly require TLS, use CA-signed certificates, and basically refuse any plaintext connections.
Right, and disabling legacy TLS is vital because of something called a downgrade attack.
A downgrade attack.
Yeah, so older versions of TLS, like 1.0 or 1.1, they have known mathematical flaws. If your server even allows those older protocols to connect, a sophisticated attacker can intercept the handshake between a legitimate client and your database.
Oh, no.
And they maliciously manipulate the traffic to say, hey, I only support the old, weak TLS 1.0.
And the database tries to be helpful, downgrades the connection, and now the attacker's looking at traffic encrypted with broken math that they can reverse engineer.
Precisely. So we force the newest TLS.
But here's where the operational reality gets really interesting for me. If we're using these CA-signed certificates, the guide mandates that we have to rotate them on a defined schedule before they expire.
Yes, you have to rotate them.
How on earth do we swap out the foundational cryptography of a live, globally distributed database without taking the whole system offline?
That is honestly one of the most complex operational maneuvers an infrastructure team performs. But the guide provides a fascinating solution based on the concept of quorum.
Quorum, like voting.
Exactly. In a distributed MongoDB environment, you don't just have one database server. You have a replica set.
Right.
Multiple nodes holding copies of the data to ensure high availability. And to elect a primary node to handle write operations, these nodes use a voting system, a quorum.
I always think of it like the Supreme Court. You need a majority vote to make a binding decision.
That's a perfect way to look at it. If you shut down all the servers at the same time to replace their encryption certificates, the Supreme Court is empty.
You lose quorum.
Yes,
Yeah.
the cluster can't elect a primary, and the entire database goes offline, taking your company's applications down with it.
So how do you change the judges without shutting down the court?
You perform a rolling update.
Okay.
The guide specifies that you have to plan certificate rotation by cycling the nodes one at a time. You take down a secondary node, apply the new certificate, restart it, and let it rejoin the cluster to prove it's healthy.
And the remaining nodes still have a majority, so the application never experiences downtime.
Exactly. You systematically move through the cluster, maintaining the quorum, but completely replacing the underlying cryptography while the engine is still running.
That is wild. Okay, so we've built this massive, highly restricted, encrypted fortress.
Yes, we have.
The ports are hidden, the identities are separated, the OS is locked in a straitjacket, and the traffic is mathematically protected.
All good things.
But how do we actually know if someone is quietly testing the locks in the middle of the night? That requires a massive surveillance system, right?
Which brings us to logging and auditing. The guide mandates that you must log all authentication events, administrative actions, role changes, and especially failed logins.
Right.
And crucially, those logs cannot just sit on the database server itself. They must be instantly forwarded to a central SIEM.
A security information and event management system.
Right.
Because if a server actually is compromised, the very first thing an experienced attacker will do is delete the local logs to cover their tracks.
Exactly. But if those logs were instantly forwarded to a secure, separate bunker the millisecond they were generated, you preserve the surveillance tape.
But wait, isn't there a massive operational tax to this level of surveillance? I mean, the guide's operational notes warn that turning on comprehensive audit logging massively increases I/O.
The input and output write operations on your storage disks, yes.
You're potentially asking the database to record millions of microactions every hour. At a certain point, the database is spending more computing power writing down what it's doing than actually doing it.
It is a heavy toll, no doubt about it. Teams have to provision significantly faster, more expensive disks to handle that extra traffic. You have to monitor the system's memory cache pressure, and you absolutely must configure strict log rotation.
What happens if you don't?
Well, if you don't automatically archive and compress old logs, they will grow infinitely until they consume 100% of the storage drive.
And then?
When the disk fills up, the database literally has nowhere to write new data, and it crashes. Your own security surveillance can accidentally cause a denial of service attack on your system.
That is terrifying. Which I guess brings us to the inevitable reality of enterprise IT.
Oh.
We have all these rigorous controls, but what happens when a team simply can't implement one of them?
It happens all the time.
Let's say there is a 10-year-old legacy application that is hard-coded to look for MongoDB on that default 27017 port, and changing the port would break a system that generates millions in revenue.
Yeah.
Or what if the developers absolutely rely on server-side scripting, which the guide tells us to explicitly disable?
Look, security is never entirely black and white. It's an exercise in risk management. And the guide introduces a formal mechanism for this reality, which is the risk register.
The risk register.
Right. If you absolutely cannot apply a recommended configuration due to a business constraint, you don't just quietly ignore it and hope the auditors don't notice. You meticulously document the exception.
You basically shine a massive spotlight on the weak point?
You do. You track that specific vulnerability in the risk register, and you assign it a specific review date.
Oh, a review date.
Yeah. The guide insists that every single exception must be treated as time-bound. It is not a permanent hall pass.
Right.
You have to force a review of those exceptions at least quarterly or immediately following any major infrastructure upgrades to evaluate if the business constraint has finally been removed.
So when the auditors do finally show up, what does this all mean for the poor engineer who has to prove that this entire ecosystem is actually secure? I noticed Appendix A of the guide acts as a cheat sheet for evidence collection, and it avoids relying on fancy graphical dashboards entirely.
That's because graphical interfaces can be manipulated, or they might cache old data. Auditors want ground truth.
Ground truth.
Yeah. The appendix focuses on evidence that is undeniable and consistent. Using read-only Mongosh command line queries to output the exact internal database configurations without any risk of accidentally changing them during the audit.
And using Linux command line tools like LSCL to visually prove the file permissions on those sensitive key files.
Or SSSLNTP to show exactly which network ports are actively listening on the machine. Command line outputs provide immutable point-in-time truths.
Right.
It shifts the entire dynamic with an auditor. You aren't saying, trust me, we configured the firewall. You're handing them the raw mathematical proof of the machine's exact state at that exact second.
Which brings us full circle, really. Securing a complex database like MongoDB isn't just about reading a static set of stereo instructions.
Definitely not.
As we've unpacked from this SOCFortress guide, it is about architecture. It requires a deep understanding of asymmetric threats, a psychological separation of who and what is accessing your data.
The operating system straitjackets.
Yes, the straitjackets. And a meticulous, brutally honest documentation of your own vulnerabilities through a risk register.
I think the most vital takeaway for anyone listening is that security knowledge is only valuable when it's actively applied to your own environment.
Absolutely.
Take a hard look at how your own organization handles its exceptions. Do you have a formalized risk register that forces you to review your tech debt, or do you just have permanent, undocumented blind spots in your architecture because someone, 3 years ago casually mentioned it was too hard to fix?
That is a highly uncomfortable question that every platform team needs to ask themselves at their next stand-up. And speaking of uncomfortable questions, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. This guide provides a brilliant, incredibly comprehensive blueprint of best practices for the year 2026. But as we watch AI and automation begin to manage infrastructure dynamically, systems that can spin up clusters, apply system straitjackets, and rotate cryptographic certificates completely on their own will, the concept of a human-readable hardening checklist soon become a relic of the past.
That's fascinating.
And if the artificial intelligence is dynamically writing and adjusting the security configurations on the fly, who audits the machine?
That is precisely the next great frontier of digital defense.
It absolutely is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of database security. We hope we helped turn those confusing stereo instructions into a clear strategic blueprint for your own invisible armored vault. We will catch you on the next one.